Welcome to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. On today's episode, we're going to get started with most common limitations you see with clients. So, let's kick it. Steph, I'm going to turn this one over to you first today.
Whenever we look at clients, to me, the main limitations, like there's two really important limitations that we see all the time with almost anyone. Limitations at the shoulder joint and the hip joint. So at the shoulder joint, it can be displayed in many ways. Like you can see it very easily on remedial exercises like trap 3 raise, for example, or bent over lateral raise, where you can clearly see there is lack of horizontal abduction or shoulder flexion at end range. But even on primary movements, like, for example, the overhead press, you can see that a lot of clients sometimes have a hard time reaching the proper position above the head. They might be short of full flexion, which is not ideal. It's not ideal in a technical perspective. It's not ideal in the sense that it's stressing the joint to a greater extent. So that client might not be ready to start loading that joint with full load at this extreme of a range of motion. So we need to address this in training. Now at the hip, you can clearly see hip issues on multi-joint movements like the squat, the deadlift, like lack of range of motion reaching the bottom position of the deadlift, like grabbing that barbell 8 inches from the floor might be an issue because of hip restriction. Squatting, you might see a leaning torso because of hip restriction, but you can also see it on assistance exercise like the split squat, where now you see a shorter stride. The client has a harder time getting into that full forward knee flexion, the full stretch of the back leg and the rectus femoris and the hip flexors being stretched in the bottom position. So all of these you can clearly see right away, and then you need to address it with the proper sequencing of exercise and the proper training modalities to make sure that you're improving these limiting factors. There's a bunch of others as well. Yeah. There's like the ankle can be a limiting factor too.
It's really popular one, the ankle.
And like once you figured out these limitations, the main thing we'll have to worry about then is finding a regression that's going to suit the client at their current level, and we can build their capacity from there. So whether that's through exercise selection or through straight up mobility means, but we'll have to find where the client currently is so we can at least let them train and have output at the level they currently are.
Yeah, and I mean, like, knowing where the client is at this point in time when you see him is really important. And the thing is, the truth is some clients might have such restriction that you will need to address mobility issues outside of the weight room. This will happen. But for the most part, as personal trainers, dealing with clients, let's say 2, 3, 4 times a week on a 1-hour session, the thing is, I believe that we need to make sure that we're addressing the issue in the weight room, because sometimes unfortunately, we can't rely on the client to do their own work on their own. And the thing is, if they're paying you for 3 times a week for 60 minutes per session, and they have like body composition goals, strength goals, et cetera, like, can you afford to spend half of that session doing mobility work and shying away of the strength and or body composition work? So you need, if it's very extreme, it needs to be done outside of it. So as a personal trainer, I believe that you need to address it in the weight room, and the exercise selection, training modality, exercise techniques, and training methods will be really important in achieving these goals in the weight room.
So I know you've mentioned shoulder, hip, and ankle. Are there other ones that you guys see a lot, or are those kind of the 3 primary ones right off the bat with the majority of clients?
The knees are often a problem with people. More pain-wise, I guess, but but they're like often restricted with knee pain.
The knees, to me, are very similar to the elbow in the sense that they're limiting factors, not necessarily on a mobility perspective, but they can become a limiting factor because of a wonky like knee or elbow that's just achy, like tennis elbow or like knee pain. But
so you're saying that there's mobility limitations and then there's pain limitations you see with a lot of clients.
Yeah, but like the knee and elbow joint, it's more of that.
Okay.
So it's a slightly different approach.
And then a lot of times if people are displaying knee or elbow pain, it can be from a joint restriction above or below it. So your wrist, shoulder, or ankle or hip. So if you address those issues, it sometimes can alleviate the pain.
I know what you guys obviously currently do with assessments for clients, but I kind of wanted to roll it back a little bit. So back when you first started as a trainer in the 90s for you two, not as long ago for you, what were you doing for your assessments back then?
I mean, initially when I started, it was really no assessment really. You just kind of had the client. We did some length tension. We tested their like flexibility just in like us taking them through certain movements and stuff, and or just even looking at their movement patterns. But it was hard like to start because you didn't really have really have a plan. And then I moved on to more strength based assessments. And for my population, the Gen Pop people, the problem is that they're just weak. So it ended up always being the same kind of like result, like the same results. I'm like, okay, so you're weak here and there, but it didn't really help me make a program that was specific to their needs in terms of mobility and stuff. So I still didn't know what exercise I should start with. Like it was just kind of trial and error. So there was no great system that I had when I first started, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big problem because, for example, Alex and I both went to university in Canada. Porrick was Ireland, so a little different. But like in Canada, the thing they taught you in exercise science in terms of assessment or evaluation was I forget the acronym, but it's the Canadian...
what was it called?
I don't know. The Canadian Personal Trainer Assessment Protocol, whatever. PNC in French.
Like toe touch.
But it was all things like that, right? Toe touch, or like for strength, it was like how many sit-ups can you do in 60 seconds?
What I did in like school.
Like
but the problem with this is, okay, it's cool. So like client A is doing 27 sit-ups in 60 seconds. Cool. You have a starting point of how many sit-ups you can do. But how is that helping me as a personal trainer build a appropriate, well-tailored program to that person? It gives me absolutely zero true information aside of his proficiency to do sit-ups in 60 seconds. So to me, like these assessments were so inadequate for the task that we had as a personal trainer dealing with that population, like the Gen Pop. And then, like Alex was saying, later on, once we graduated, like I graduated in 2000, then I started doing a bunch of continuing education with strength coaches. So now, like we're the pendulum is swinging on the other way, the other side, and now what we're learning is mostly like strength assessment that are applied to elite level athletes, that now you're all excited about it. You're a young 22-year-old coach. You bring this back to the gym. You have like a, grandpa starting training with you, and then you put him through that entire strength assessment. So now you have your client's 1 RM bench press, 1 RM Scott curl. So you have an indication of their maximal strength level, but like who cares at that point in time with that clientele? Like we still didn't see anything in terms of mobility, movement pattern proficiency, what they can tolerate, what they can't tolerate. And then like we had like lower body tests that were pretty, like for example, like one test that we used to do all the time that was pretty easy to apply was the CLAT test. So it's a test that was devised by a physiotherapist, Lois Klatt. She's from Illinois. She devised a test like in the 80s, I think. But all it is you're doing a little hop from a step down to the ground, landing on one foot. And then you as the coach, you analyze how the person is landing. So if the person is skipping forward, it's a sign of maybe a weaker posterior chain muscle. If the knee's caving in, it might be associated to weak vastus medialis and or maybe weak gluteus medius. So now you have these types of information, but the problem is because we're not dealing with the athletic population, a lot of these people, their first jump was all over the place. They would always be hopping forward. But anyways, at the end of the day, the prognostic of that assessment as far as lower body goes was always the same thing. Weak vastus medialis, weak hamstring, weak quadratus lumborum, tight psoas. So guess what was step number 1 in 99.9% of cases?
Split squats.
Split squats, front foot elevated, low pulley, and a remedial step up like the heel elevated step up. So after a few years of doing this, it's like every female on average that was untrained would max out on bench press at 65 pounds.
But it's not even that. Just remember how they look, what they look like when they were trying to do these exercises. Like a female who's never used a bar is being asked to lift like a maximal weight for her, even if it's just 70 pounds. Like it's like they don't even know how to weight train, and we're asking them to do like a maximal lift.
Oh yeah, no, I know, but my point with this little story was just to say that at the end of the day, the more we applied this assessment protocol, the more the results were always the same. It was always the same thing because the tests weren't like, it looked like it was specific, but it was not that specific, at least not in a program design perspective. So you ended up always doing the same thing. You didn't necessarily come out of there with a true starting point of where to go with your client. So that to me was a big limiting factor. That's why like we did it for a few years, right? Remember like when we first learned this like in 2002, we were doing this, and then like we kind of like faded out of this rather quickly once we realized that it's not really truly helping me write a better training program.
Yeah, but like looking back now, because I did strength-based assessments at times as well, it's such a strange place to start your new client. Yeah. That you've very, very, like obviously you can take a history and ask them about their training history and all that, but trying to figure out their strength levels, to figure out discrepancies between certain muscles and all that is great if you've trained that client for a while and you know they're moving them competency. Yeah. If you don't know how well this client moves, it is such an irrelevant number that you're just putting the cart before the horse. Like you need to take a step back. Yeah, you need to take a step back and ensure that they can perform the moves properly first. And if they can't perform the moves properly, where is a logical starting point?
Yeah. And also like that clientele, a lot of the time, they barely have any coordination whatsoever. So like that maximal strength results you're seeing is so like irrelevant or false in the sense that add in 3 months of training, like it's a completely different thing right now. So there's lack of coordination. There's also lack of ability to recruit motor units, which will affect the score of these tests drastically. So to me, you're better off stepping back, letting go of the strength component, and let's look at the main joints involved in the exercises that you use in strength training as a personal trainer to build efficiency with that client. Now you see how they do at these lifts, and then depending on how they do and what the limiting factors are, then you regress to the point that suits that client, and then you progress forwards to reach the standard that you have.
And I think with assessments, I think there's a huge buy-in from clients with that first appointment. So I've worked the front of a gym. So knowing that the clients come in, they are ready to train, but they're still nervous to get started with just starting right into the sessions. And they don't necessarily have confidence in you yet. So I think that first initial appointment, when you take them through some level of assessment, there's a huge amount of buy-in depending on what you're doing in that first session. And it's also the opportunity for you as a coach to get kind of some before, like a starting point for those clients before moving forward.
Yeah.
And then, like, based on, I've never actually done this assessment as a practitioner, but I was brought through it when I was back when I played football. It was the FMS. So talking about getting buy-in with the client. So lots of people still use the FMS, but the qualifying criteria for FMS is you get scored 1 out of 3, and depending on how much of a total score is, whether you're allowed to train or not. Oh. It's a very basic overview. And how people train to get better at the FMS is do the tests on the FMS. So yes, no shit, you're going to get better if you're training the tests. So
is that functional movement screening? Okay, that's what that is.
And it's to me, it's one of the biggest wastes of times, because all you're doing is train this specific thing that is going to help you pass the test, is not actually put you in a better position to have better training outcomes or less likelihood of injuries. So it's just one of those that you have to make sure the assessment you're carrying out does have some carryover to the results that you want to get.
And like it's a little bit, I'm going to take a tangent to get back to the assessment. But what I think is lost sometime in our community is like principles and laws of strength training that cannot be bent in order to elicit a training response. So we talked about it in the previous podcast, where in strength training, what is the goal of strength training? To build strength and muscle mass. That's all it does. Well, of course, it improves it improves neuromuscular coordination and on. But like in essence, you're building strength, you're building mass. So if you're doing strength training, this is a outcome that you're looking for. But we like to try to be cute in the weight room sometimes and do a bunch of random exercises at random loads to make it fun, make it interesting, make the client move. And having your client move is great, and people should move more. But when you're in the weight room and you have an hour to gain strength and mass, it needs to be specific and targeted to movements and exercises that will lead to an increase in strength. So we know that the minimum intensity is 70% of 1 RM. So if you're doing a bunch of drills or a bunch of exercises to improve a movement pattern or anything like that, but that the load is so light that you're not building anything, well, are you actually improving your client's performance in the weight room? Are you getting him closer to his goal? So because of that in mind, it's very important for me when I look at an assessment that I'm assessing the client, so I have a true starting point on true exercises, so I can start loading them without issues right away, so that right away from the get-go they can work towards building strength and mass instead of wasting a bunch of time doing movements or activities that have zero bearing on strength development.
Kind of goes back to what we were talking about in episode 1, where you say strength training isn't for everyone, but I think that's what separates personal training and strength coaches from boot camps. So if those people just want those things, they want to move, they do go to boot camps. But what we're trying to provide is a high-priced, higher quality service to our clients. So they can get that in boot camps, but when you have clients coming to you, they're looking to gain far more from those sessions with you. And that's when personal training and assessments come into play.
Yeah. So I just think it needs to be targeted and truly targeted.
Well, that definitely leads us into, like, when we were developing the MAP assessment, that some of the things that we really thought were going to be a part of it that we left by the wayside because it didn't have the specific carryover to the outcome that we assumed it was going to have. So the biggest one there is the length tension test.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah, that was interesting when we looked at the different, like how much flexibility you have in one joint, and then does that allow you to do a certain movement? The carryover wasn't.
It was very
rarely. It was rarely there.
Minimal to non-existent at times.
Yeah.
So like a really good example was when we measured ankle dorsiflexion. So both me and Kelsey did the ankle dorsiflexion using the output and getting the degree reading. I had 34 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion. Kelsey had 43 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion. When I was in a full squat at the bottom, I used all 34 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion to maintain position, whereas Kelsey only needed 33 degrees based on her structural makeup and was still able to achieve a lower squat position than I probably can with a 30-degree wedge.
And that's the problem when you're only looking at one joint.
Yeah.
Right? To squat, you need multiple joints. So she was able to squat with less dorsiflexion, probably because she has more hip mobility than you.
Exactly.
Right? So that's why we didn't see value in just analyzing it joint per joint for the tension.
It's why we still measure the ankle joint as a single joint, but we make sure to integrate the measurements with more compound movements within the assessment.
Yeah, and we saw the same thing with shoulder extension.
Yep.
So we isolated shoulder extension as a length tension. Kelsey had the most shoulder extension. Porrick had the least shoulder extension, and by far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then when we went to dip, now you have to understand that the humerus angle is a little different in a dip than a length tension test. It's also loaded. Now, all of a sudden, of all of us, the person who had the most shoulder extension was Porrick.
Yep.
So that's the thing. We're not saying that the length tension test is useless, because it does have value in the sense that you can at least show, here is your starting point. Yeah. Then over time, now you've built up range of motion, you've improved, great. But what we're saying is, if you're pressed for time, if you want something that's specific and targeted to help you write a training program right now, to only use length tension is misleading, because it's not really relevant to actual loaded strength training movement. And we've seen it, we've played with it a lot. And we've seen it so much that we're like, okay, well, there's no point, because there's no carryover. So that's why we prefer looking at how the body moves through movement, through actual strength training movement, so we can have true feedback on what to do in the weight room, because the length tension just doesn't cut it. Same thing with shoulder flexion.
Yep.
If you're measuring shoulder flexion in a length tension test to qualify your client to do an overhead press, it's extremely misleading, because first of all, you don't overhead press with a barbell with a 8-inch grip where the humerus is right by your ears, right? You have more of a mid grip, so the humerus angle is a little bit outwards, so it's not even the same placement of length tension when you're doing that overhead press. So all of this becomes less relevant for true assessment of strength training movement.
For those of you that don't know, our MAP assessment course, MAP stands for Movement Analysis and Progressions. And it took them, this was
a labor of love.
This was over a year of working to perfect what this course ended up being, which on our part, everyone always thinks that it's just like we make the course, we deliver it, but it goes through a lot of trial and error, and also trying to perfect it so that you, all listening, have something that you can immediately implement after completing the online course. So if you guys kind of want to talk about what went into the development of the MAP assessment course, and then also even going back, it was over a year ago that this kind of all started?
Well, a big thing to start with is everything in the MAP assessment course is things we have done throughout our history as coaches. It took so long to develop because we try and streamline things as much as possible to make it the most efficient. To turn it into a system. To turn it into a system so it is reproducible, and it's going to be the easiest way for coaches to learn the content and apply the content as quickly as possible. So that's why it takes so long for some of these courses, even though the content could be it could be almost identical to what we've done for 10 years. Yeah. But it has to be delivered in a very specific way.
Yeah.
Making sure it fit within a 60-minute session so it's sellable and usable for the strength coach or personal trainer. There's many things behind it. Like easy to remember, easy to understand, easy to apply, easy to implement, easy to assess and analyze. I remember like Alex and I did like a certification, a lower body certification in 2004 where one of the assessment was the overhead squat assessment with a broomstick. And you had to look at the movement and somehow by looking at a person overhead squat, come up with a scoring on a 10-point chart. So is this a 6? Is it a 7? Blah, blah.
And then what does that mean?
And then you tested 12 weeks later are you a 7 or an 8? Or are you still a 6 or still a 5? But it's so hard to see. It's hard to see compensation, like what's going on. Like, is it really tight hip flexors or is it it's all over the place. Plus, so what? No, but it's true. So so let's say I remember there was a guy in class that scored a 2 on the overhead squat. Okay, according to the instructor.
So not good.
Yeah, so that was a 2 out of 10.
Okay.
So technically, according to the source, if your score was less than 6, you couldn't squat. Okay. Well, that person was a top USA powerlifting competitor.
Yeah.
So we can obviously squat. But he couldn't overhead squat with a broomstick. So, which isn't, I'm not saying it's great. Obviously, there were some limitations, but it had nothing to do with the ability or not to squat.
So imagine you have that client and then he comes and you tell him, you're not going to be able to squat because you scored a 2. He's going to be like, he'll walk away. Right? So
but like he clearly had limitations. But
sure.
But these limitations were not going to be addressed by squatting. But it clearly didn't mean that he shouldn't squat. It just means that there's other steps to take. But simply from the overhead squat, you didn't really know what these steps were, nor were the steps actually taught in the course.
Yeah.
It was just like, okay, he's a 2, he shouldn't squat. So what do you do then? Split squat, step up. Okay. And then he should be able to squat? Yeah. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Especially with the untrained, right? That was one of my pet peeves with that approach. You have a bad score, you shouldn't squat. If you're an elite lifter, no, not big of a deal. You shy away from squat, you do other stuff, you come back to squat, you're actually stronger in your squat. Why? Because now you've worked on the kinks. But you're so elite that your neural grooving on a squat pattern is so high that you're able to get back into it right away. But if you're dealing with a novice trainee who's still struggling to have a proper motor pattern on a back squat, and now you're telling him to not squat for 12 weeks or 24 weeks while you're working on other things. Now you're improving the other things. And now you're thinking that because you improved the other things, now you can go and the squat is going to look like Piros Dima squatting. It won't, because now you need to relearn what it is to squat. You need to develop the skills to squat again. And as a novice, this takes a while. So now you've lost 12 or 24 weeks of learning potential that you need to regain So to me, you're better off using a squat variation that the client can handle. So at least you get some of that neural learning from a multi-joint squat pattern, and then you spend time working on the actual limiting factors with true targeted movements later on in the session. But to shy away from an exercise, to me, is just too drastic, especially with the novice. The elite is a different story.
And that's why we developed the map the way we did, right? So we have the most common exercises we'll use in programming and stuff. And then we assess, whatever the standard that we set, and then we can regress them if they can't do it, because we want them to be able to, day one, be doing some sort of regression from these exercises so that they can work themselves back up to there.
Yeah, and like Porrick was saying, it's important to not just look at the joint in isolation. So that's why we like to, like the ankle, for example. Yes, we test the ankle per se to see what's going on with the ankle, but we cannot just use the ankle as the holy grail of or a determining factor of what to do in the weight room, because as soon as you integrate other things, it's misleading. Like, for example, me, when we did the leg tension, I had more ankle dorsiflexion than Porrick.
Yep.
I had like 38 degrees. According to research, 38 degrees is the perfect ankle dorsiflexion angle to squat. Like, you should have 38 degrees plus or minus 5. So from 33 to 43, according to research, you should have no problem squatting. Well, I have 38 degrees. I can squat, but squatting feet flat on the floor, I can, but it doesn't look super nice.
Yep.
So now, because we looked beyond just the ankle per se, now I know that I still need to have a squat variation because other elements in my squatting patterns are limiting, which in my case is more the hip.
Yeah, exactly.
So now I need to consider the hip to improve my squat, not just the ankle. Because imagine, if we were just doing leg tension. So now I'm testing my ankle. 38 degrees, bam, you pass, good. No ankle issues. You can squat, no problem. So now I go squatting and I'm shredding my back because my form as I reach the bottom third is all out of whack. But I keep on going because the ankle dorsiflexion test told me I'm good.
Yep.
Well, no, I had other things, but I could only see it once it was integrated to a multi-joint movement.
And on the flip side, so for me, for example, I don't have any dorsiflexion, but I still want to squat. So it's like, and my dorsiflexion, I've been working on that for like, since I was a teenager. I was a gymnast. I still didn't have it then, and we stretched a lot. But like, you can find something. You elevate the heels, then I can still squat because my hips are good. So it's like, you want to find a way to let people train the big lifts, and so that they can really have a good. Because
elevating the heel creates a false dorsiflexion, if you want. So it compensates for your lack of dorsiflexion. Yeah. And also, it's important to understand and accept that sometimes people are not going to improve dorsiflexions simply because of structural restriction. Yeah. Like, I'll give one quick, easy example. I was training this Major League Baseball player in 2009 that he broke his left ankle during a game running around the base, completely shattered his left ankle. During his rehab with the team, he was not with me at that time. He's doing the rehab with the team, so he's training in the weight room, and as he's re-racking his dumbbells after a set of press, he drops a dumbbell on his right ankle and breaks his right ankle. So now the guy had both ankles broken, and we're talking about, like, that was November, and he wants to play in spring training in February. It's a contract year. Like, he was due for his actual first real contract. So then after talking to Matt Alday and Chris Carpenter, like, he comes to me, and I'm assessing him. And I do, like, man, you have zero dorsiflexion.
He can barely walk.
Yeah. But we're talking about like a 26-year-old professional baseball player at the prime of his career. I'm not going to squat him. No, we're going to squat. But we used wedges. Yeah. So what? We used wedges. He was able to squat, created resiliency at the knee joint, built some strength. He was still performing on the field. Yeah, he even won MVP. So it's okay. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes there are restrictions that doesn't allow you to. But like I was not going to be stubborn and like fighting bone on bone like forever to try to get more ankle dorsiflexion. So it is what it is.
Yeah.
And it's funny, like in real life, when you think about it, like how often do you really, I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't squat, you shouldn't be able to squat with your heels flat, but like in movement, your heels are always a little elevated. Like in sport, you're running, you're in a deep like lunge or something. So it's okay. I'm saying that it's still okay to train that squat with your heels elevated.
Yeah. I mean, you know, like you still want to reach goal, a standard of ankle dorsiflexion. Like for the simple reason, the Swedes and the Swiss did research like late 90s, early 2000, where they associated ankle mobility. So basically it was very straightforward. Yeah. The more ankle mobility you have, the least the incidence of any type of lower body injury happen. So it is important. Mm-hmm. Still work on it. But like Alex says, I think that the lesson here is don't get caught up in, I don't have enough ankle dorsiflexion, I shouldn't squat.
Yeah. And I think it also goes to specifically talking on the squat. As a coach, it takes a little bit to find the right position for people. And sometimes everyone's, wants, people say feet straight, people say toes out, but that is very individual. I know for me for a while, like I've always had a decent squat. I've always squatted all the way down. But now in the last 2 years, basically, I mean, you have me squatting the majority, like sometimes 2 times a week. I'm squatting a lot and I'm just feet flat in my Jordans. That's fine. But for a while, like I needed my heels elevated, and it was really figuring out my stance again that finally got it to be like, okay, now this feels great. I don't need my heels elevated. The squat looks good. It feels good. And now I have no issues with it. But it was kind of figuring out the stance for it. And that's very individual. And I think it takes time, and that comes with the art of coaching and really looking at the anatomy of someone or even their movement to perfect what is right for that person.
Yeah. And that, if you don't know, like one very simple tip I learned from Al Vermeil that I think is cool and works very well. I'm not saying that you don't need to make adjustments later on, but if you have a new client and you absolutely have no idea of which squat stance to use, without any type of information, tell that client to do a vertical jump. Mm-hmm. They will naturally get in the position that they feel more comfortable and strongest.
On the landing.
Well, but even to jump. So just based off of what you see in that jump, you can reproduce that position in the squat, and it should work for most people. You might need to do a few minor adjustments, but...
Or another really easy thing is the scar test. So just go and find where they've got the most hip mobility. And then from there, depending on the angle of the femur, just make sure the feet are going to be going in the same direction.
What was that one you said?
Scour.
Scour. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. They're laying on their back and then you're...
Yeah. Pretty sure that's McGill.
I mean, I don't know if he, but I've been taught the hip scour test by Stuart McGill.
Yeah, that's where I've always seen it. Yeah. But it's a really simple one if someone is really struggling to find it.
Yeah.
You don't normally need to go that far, but if someone's really struggling to find a position, it'll help them.
The struggling part is really important because to me, the problem, and I think Alex is the same, is me, don't ask me why, but my hands, my fingers, my ability to feel with my hands is atrocious.
Like as like a manual therapy type of thing?
Like,
you mean?
Yeah.
That's why like every time, like in the past at Pelican Group, whenever we we had to do PIMS type of stuff or fat tool or any type of ART. And it's like, hey, Steph, like, do you feel the knot here? What?
You're like, nope.
But do you feel here? There's more tone here. There's less tone there. Nah, I don't feel anything. I don't know. So even the hip scour test, sometimes I'm struggling. Like, well, is it me really pushing into it? Or, so I'm just saying,
don't fake it.
If that's not your thing,
for me, that's a last resort test.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah.
So I kind of, for those of you who haven't looked into our MAP assessment course, if we kind of want to go over how that course is laid out, because it is really different from all of our other online courses, our program design, periodization, optimizing strength ratios. It was just Steph lecturing in front of a green screen with slides. But with the MAP assessment course, I really wanted to film it in the gym to really set it up, because it's a very actionable, practical course. So if you kind of want to go through how that course is laid out in terms of when someone gets started with it.
Yeah, so we've separated the body in like 3 parts. So we have the upper body, you have the lower body, and then we have the trunk. Now, the trunk, of course, like mobility, it's not really the thing we're looking at here. We're looking more at stability and strength endurance through the test. But then the upper body and lower body has more to do with movement patterns. So dynamic mobility through strength training movements. So what happens when you're doing this type of movement, and based on what you see, you have regressions. And then we do have a few single joint on key remedial movements, like especially around the shoulder or the ankle, to really like fine tune the assessment. But the big part of it is looking at strength training movement, what's their ability and proficiency doing it, and then based off of that, where can we start the training tomorrow?
Yeah, that's the big part. It's finding the best starting point for the client, and then laying out progressions to try and get them to either get to what we're deeming a standard, or at least address some of the limitations they may have.
But that they can still train.
Yep, the whole time they can train. They can train. But then outside of training limitations in terms of structural or mobility issues, like one thing you can find is people just have really bad movement quality in terms of muscular coordination. So that could be they just need practice doing the lifts. So you could be screening them for, say, an overhead press, and it just looks awful. But it's maybe because they've never overhead pressed, and their ability to brace their whole body while standing, while controlling an implement going around their head is the issue. And it's just a matter of them practicing the skill. So sometimes when you're assessing these people, you also have to take into consideration that practicing of the skill can have just as good of carryover as addressing movement limitations in terms of mobility.
And it is a skill, right? Like, so you talk to an athlete and you tell an athlete about bench press, they don't really see it as a skill movement. You know, it's very simplistic compared to what they're used to do. But the average person, the quote unquote general population, a bench press is a complex movement because it does require a lot of coordination and synchronization. And then the problem is us as coaches, especially in the early stages, we love the fluff. We want the complex. We want to be cool. We want to know everything. But I see it all the time. Coaches will know all the origins and insertions of every muscle in the body, but they don't know how to coach a bench press. So then they're training their clients with the best training programs in the world, perfectly periodized, with crazy techniques. But then you look at the client train, the feet are moving. The abdominal is soft, not even braced, no tension in the legs. Poor bar path. Because all the coach sees is he's lying on his back, he's pushing a barbell off of their chest, he's doing a bench press. But there's more to it. You want to be good at bench press, you need to have like a proper stance. You need to have tension in the legs, tension in the glutes, tension in the abs, tensions in the upper back. You need to have a proper bar path. You need to squeeze the hell out of the barbell, bend that barbell, get activation. So this takes time just in a coaching perspective. And then once that novice trainee gets that, then you actually need to start building intermuscular coordination. And here's the problem. The untrained, like, anytime you train, you will build intermuscular coordination and a certain level of intramuscular coordination. But where you are in your training age will bias either or. So in the early stages, it's more important, especially with multi-joint compound lifts, to learn intermuscular coordination. So the synergistic synchronization of all the muscles involved in a movement. But in order to properly learn intermuscular coordination, you need lighter loads. So in the early stages of training, once you've shown the proper technique and then you understand how to create tension, then you need to rehearse the movement pattern over and over and over and over to build that intermuscular coordination. But then all this means is now your client is stronger, but he's not stronger because he's really stronger. He's stronger because he's built intermuscular coordination. At that point, now the real work starts, and that's when you need to focus on building intramuscular coordination. But intramuscular coordination is better built at 80% plus. Even more so, 90% plus is when you're actually truly developing intramuscular coordination, and that's the ability to go and recruit more and more and more and more motor units. And once you do that, can you really become strong? So it's a lot of steps. And the reason why I'm telling all this is it's a lot of steps that takes a lot of time, that takes appropriate coaching, which is why it's important from the get-go when you have a new client that you assess them specifically on specific exercises so you can start them with the real deal right from the bat, so that you're not wasting time in that learning curve, because it takes forever. And in today's world, people are impatient.
So when you have that new client that's newer to strength training, and I've kind of heard both sides of this. So with everything you're saying, is it starting them? So they need rehearsal.
Yes.
But that's also not, you don't want them to lose the good form. So regarding selecting reps for new clients, is it something where you see them closer to like the 8 to 12 when they first get started? Or is it in terms of like 4 to 6 quality reps, or is that more individualized depending on the client? Like when someone's really getting started, how do you, in your eyes, I mean, what
4
reps
to 6 is probably a little on the low end. Like the 10 to 12 rep range is a sweet spot where you can lift enough loads, because you're still building strength. You still want that 70% intensity, but it's not too hard and it's not too long for them so that they can really focus on them.
But I'm assuming with some clients, you might need to drop that down a little bit because they can lose good form.
Yeah, so like one thing, if someone's really, really bad at learning motor patterns, what you can do is do sub-maximal loads at lower number of reps and bump up the sets so they get more exposures. And it's not really, like, you're not going to follow this in a periodization model, as to say this is going to be more like learning potential over like a course of a few months. So say you're starting and you're giving them 4 to 6 reps. So say it's 5, since we established we did not do rep ranges. Yeah. So say they're doing 10 sets of 5 instead of 10 sets of 5, 8 sets of 5 is probably more appropriate. But you're going to get, like, it's going to be at a load that it's going to challenge their positioning, but not challenge their strength, to say. So they're going to be building the intramuscular coordination. And now they're going to be getting a lot of rehearsal of high quality repetitions. And it shouldn't take that long because they'll be tapping into such minimal amounts of motor unit recruitment. you can afford to reduce the rest period.
Exactly, because you don't want from the get-go to train above 80% of 1RM, because the client does not have the skill to work at that high of an intensity. So 80% of 1RM, technically speaking, assuming you know the actual 1RM of that newbie client, is 7 reps or less.
But it's also fine to get started with a client and not know their...
No, I know. But so that's why I'm saying it's even more so important to be in that 8 to 12 bracket, because not only do you need rehearsal, so now you have more reps to rehearse, but now because you're able to do 10 or 12 reps, you know that the load is light enough to not stress the strength component and the intramuscular coordination. So it's light enough that you can actually build the skill of intermuscular coordination, the skill of getting better at the lift. But then, like Bork said, the problem though, certain lifts, let's say front squat, for example, the complexity because of the front rack position is such that 12 reps of it might be counterproductive, because there will be a breakdown in technique because of time under tension. So with that, a move like that, you're still training at 70 or let's say 75% of 1RM, but you're doing some maximal effort and you're doing multiple sets. So you have the same exact amount of volume, which we're talking about. Like, in order for a novice to learn a skill on a lift, you should have about 40 to 60 reps of rehearsal on a movement pattern. So, you need reps, you need sets.
I think another thing I see a lot with new clients when they would get started with us is not having the ability to brace or even breathe properly. So Alex, I see you. What's the drill you do that you add in with a lot of people when they're not good at the whole bracing and breathing?
The low ab drill?
The low ab drill.
Wall press. So I have them push up against the wall. So like by pushing into the wall, if they're laying down, it pulls their ribs down. If both feet are up, I might not start with both feet up, maybe 1 foot down, 1 foot up. But then it's just really like trying to lower that leg without like arching the back. But at the same time, I also have them practice breathing at the same time. So then as they're lowering the leg, then I have them inhale really slowly, but without like inhaling through the chest. So they're still inhaling through the belly, and then they exhale really, really slow. And that's
And when do you normally add that into the session?
Towards the end on a leg day.
Yeah.
That's when we do abs, but that's a good one for people. It's really hard.
Yeah.
And one other point that I wanted to bring up that Steph was probably going to get towards but got sidetracked by his intramuscular coordination is when people are moving their feet all about and soft torso, the chances are they're also moving their head about. So they're constantly changing the line of sight. And if someone wants to get efficient in a movement and they constantly change the line of sight, every rep's going to look different.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we see that a lot with the coaches when they're training in class here. It's just like, keep your head.
Yeah.
Charles used to say, you can't shoot a cannon off a canoe. So your body has to be solid, and then you'll be able to exert more force in whatever lift that you're doing.
Yeah, so a big thing to reinforce your clients is for them to pick a focal spot somewhere, depending on whatever the lift is. Obviously, if it's a squat, don't have it 6 inches in front of their feet. Have it somewhere in the horizon. But have your focal spot, stay there throughout the duration of the set, and you're way more likely to have more consistent repetitions.
Okay, so does anyone have any closing remarks regarding the common limitations with clients or assessments or anything? Because Steph, you have a call coming up, so we're going to wrap this up shortly. So any other...
If you trained at 90 degrees all the time, you're going to have a lot of limitations.
Okay, before we end today's episode, I did want to mention for all of you listening that don't know, we have 2 programs on the Train Heroic Marketplace. It's only $30 a month to train with us on there. We have Tempo Town and Intense City. I know Porrick, Intensity started the Bulgarian method this week, right?
They started the Bulgarian method this week. So Intense City is built around strength and power macro cycles. We are into our first power macro cycle, and this is our first power method. So Bulgarian method's up, and it's a velocity contrast between 2 barbell lifts. It's going to be fun. Like, we're only in day 2 of it, so I haven't actually seen too many numbers come in yet, but I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy it. It's a good one. They're going to feel great. We've prescribed their max effort percentages and their dynamic effort percentages, so they're going to know exactly what loads to use and really get the most out of this system.
And then what's going on in Tempo Town?
Tempo Town, we're in week 1 of macrocycle 2. So Tempo Town, we're using the 14-day microcycle structure. So it's 16 week-long macrocycles, which I think everyone likes for a change of pace. They are moving. This is a strength-based macro cycle. They just finished off a hypertrophy-based macro cycle. Very much so in the world of strength training, not bodybuilding type of hypertrophy. But yep, strength-based macro cycles just kicked off, and we are in a normal concentric block, and then they hit up eccentrics in 3 weeks' time.
Very cool. Okay.
So what's the best way to get to that?
Link in bio.
Link in bio. Search it up on Train Heroic.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else, Steph, for today?
Nope.
Thanks for tuning in, fam. We'll see you again next week.
G-Unit.
Lloyd Banks.